Hello and welcome to These Are the Days of Our Podcast. I'm Lisa.
And I'm Jen, and today we're celebrating museums, which is celebrated on May the 18th. So, Lisa, tell me about museums. Do you have a favorite museum? Do you love or hate museums?
I obviously love them.
Yeah,
As like the number one plaque reader, you see a plaque, you have to
it's
read it.
learning.
It's a
Yes,
rule
of
in
course.
life. Yeah, it's got to learn. I love museums. I don't know what to say about museums because I just think they're the greatest and I've been to so many of them. I did look up like the top museums in the world and I've been to every single one of them, so like it just proves my love for museums.
I also wanted to add that we have gone to many museum-based events together, showing our deep and
Mhm.
enduring love for museums and events coming together in happy harmony. And so I just wanted to briefly touch on a few of the coolest ones because guys, we're so cool and so good at learning things and doing stuff. Most recently, we went and did yoga under a blue whale skeleton at the Natural History Museum here in London, which was amazing.
It was really cool.
Mhm.
That one was actually really cool.
We also were, I would say, quite trendy on the nights at the museum because I think we were some of the early adopters
Mhm.
of this, and it was like one of those like very cool and hip events where the museum was open late and there was street food vendors and DJs and
And
dinosaur
bars.
bones. It was just the best.
Yeah, we've done some really cool things in museums, and we've been to a lot of museums. What would you say is your favorite museum?
Oh, so you are going to hate my answer to this because
I think I can guess what it is, and I think it's so dumb. Of like all the museums in the world, the Louvre, the National Gallery in London, the Met, you're gonna pick the ABBA Museum.
I am gonna pick the ABBA Museum because it is the funnest museum I've ever been to. I've been a couple of times because I love it so much. The ABBA Museum is in Stockholm, and it is so fun and so interactive. Did you know that you can get a music video of yourself dancing with ABBA holograms? Or I don't know that you needed this, but you can get it at the ABBA Museum, an audition tape of you belting out your favorite ABBA songs to audition to be the fifth member of ABBA. It's honestly so fun. I had the greatest time. I would go back in a heartbeat. And I know that is less cool and less cultured and sophisticated. What's your favorite museum?
I actually don't know. But I was trying to think of from a year of traveling, which I guess was like 3 years ago. We went to the Cocoa Museum in La Paz in Bolivia, and we got to try out real Coca-Cola in the cafe. So like made like that still had the cocaine extract in it, and it was amazing. Oh my god, we were so tired it just like wakes you up.
Good old housewives with their heroin drug addict lives in the 1920s and 30s and
Yeah,
40s.
so really that was a really cool museum. I mean, I'd have to say obviously the type of museums I'd obviously pick art galleries and then therefore I'd probably pick the Barnes collection in Philadelphia. And actually one of the
Mm.
most unique museums I've ever been to was also in Philadelphia and it's Eastern State Penitentiary and it's the very first penitentiary in the United States and it's the history of prisons and it's so you would
Oh.
love it because it stopped being used in the 80s and so half of the prison has like this tree growth and that just like infiltrates the cells and the walls so you're just like walking through the hallway and you look into a cell and there's just like a tree growing in it. It's absolutely beautiful and then very informative, has a lot of information about prisons and jailing, especially in the United States, and it's really really cool. So I'd say those 3 I like.
This is a question you may not want to answer, but what's the worst museum you've been to?
I don't know if I've been to a bad museum.
You think that's
I mean,
a
sometimes you go to them and they're just, like, so boring and you're like, "Okay, this is a little scandalous." But, like, you go to the Uffizi in Florence, which is, the home of Renaissance art, and you're like, "Oh, how beautiful. Another picture of Madonna and chubby Jesus." Very original Renaissance artist. And then so you're like, yeah, you see the cool, important pieces, and then you're like, "Oh, another fresco of Jesus, shocking." Just, you know,
Yeah.
so avant-garde for your time, Renaissance
I
artist.
think that I would absolutely say that there are sections of
Mhm.
some museums that are really boring and that I hardly ever go into. But then I also think when you go to a museum, you hit the wall in
Yes,
terms
that's
of
100%.
ability to absorb information and be excited about things. And so you're just like, oh, great, another really important thing that has shaped our entire concept of being human. Awesome.
Whoa, everything's so important and my brain hurts. Yeah, pretty much,
Yeah.
pretty much.
Yeah.
I feel like that's true for, like, anything. You go to the V&A in London or the British Museum or anything, and it's all like, "Oh, okay."
Mhm. Yeah, and now that we live in London, we have the ability to go to these museums really frequently. So I've started just picking 1 or 2 wings to visit, and then I can really enjoy them, and then I don't get completely overwhelmed, and I
Mhm.
think that's such a luxurious way of enjoying a museum. And the last time I was in the British Museum, I spent most of my time in the Japan
Mhm.
section, and there's all of these little ceramic, um, figurines that were tiny little figurines that were like buttons and pins, and there's some very lewd sculptures that Japanese men used to have, like, pinned to their garments and in their hair.
I love it.
Amazing. And it's like these tiny little things, and if I had tried to go and see all of the antiquities included in the museum, I never would have noticed and read about this very interesting and bizarre blip in Japanese male fashion. So that was pretty
Yeah,
cool.
that is pretty cool.
Should we talk about what like the history of museums? Why do museums exist and why do they matter? Why do we collect things and then visit them?
Yeah, let's talk about why they matter. Well, I mean, obviously, I feel like I'm arguing for something that would be surprised people argue against. But I mean, I think it's very obvious that they teach us, they inspire us, they make us smarter, they preserve everything from history for later generations. They are a great place for research, so they hire people to study these things and so we can learn from the past. I mean, but I guess there is a dark side for museums. Like we know, there's everything everything in history is through a gaze historically,
Mhm.
through a predominantly white and male lens. Curators obviously have their own choices in how they display things or what they display in their collections. Like the British Museum has the most artifacts in the entire world of any museum, and it only displays like a quarter of what they own at any given time. So you're like, well, so who's picking what and where? And then
But even before that curation process, there's the really dark history
mhm,
of the legacies of colonialism, of war, of exploitation, of stealing cultural artifacts. And then that continues today. And it becomes this really unanswerable question, I think, about who should have the stuff, who should have
yeah,
what stuff, and when should we have to give it back, and when should
yeah.
we have, that sort of question. I'd like to hear your thoughts on
Well, no,
this.
and that's what I was gonna say, say because the British Museum is probably the most famous example. So they have what they call the Lord Elgin marbles, which are the pieces of the frieze that are from the Parthenon in Athens, Greece. And so he discovered them in the 1800s and took them back to the UK when Greece didn't care about them, and now Greece for years has wanted them back. And they even, if you go into the British Museum, so if you walk, okay, you walk in the front doors, you turn left, there's the Rosetta Stone right there. No big deal. One of those the biggest, most important things you'll ever see in your life. And you continue past the Rosetta Stone and go straight to the end, and you enter this room, and it's absolutely stunning. It has all these skylights, so it's really bright, and you can see all the Lord Elgin marbles just around, and they're displayed just like they were displayed on the Parthenon, and they have a pamphlet in the center that says they're never giving them back. And they won't give them back because they argue. I was like, well, the British Museum is free. You can just come and see them. They're now part of British history, and anyone can come see them. And you're like, well, if you go to the Parthenon in Athens, something is very much missing.
Very obviously missing. And for people that live in Greece, they may not be able to just walk to the British Museum on a regular basis to see what is also somewhat problematically called the Lord Elgin
Yeah.
marbles. Like, that in and of itself is
Yeah.
ridiculous. He didn't make them. And he also didn't quote unquote find them. They were already there.
Yeah. Yeah.
He didn't discover them. Yeah, so a really problematic history, and but I think it's the thing about museums that is probably why they exist and why they're so entangled and difficult is, like, it's all about objects and our desire as humans to collect things that have meaning, and we think about even just the things that we like, our own stuff. We like it and it has meaning, and then what museums do is they try and collect them and capture some of that meaning, and is really, I find it is a really interesting idea, but this has like happened for literally centuries, that people have been trying to preserve things from the past and try to curate and capture what it meant to be human at a certain time and what objects have either practical or symbolic
Yeah,
importance.
no,
So
100%. You're 100% right. And
yeah.
and museums have been around for one way or another for a long time. So I read that, yeah, in Mesopotamia, dating between like the 3rd and 2nd millennia BC, they have prototype museums, which were kind of like libraries, palaces, temples, but that had rooms for what was the preservation and communication of knowledge. And but I guess the modern museum kind of comes around, was first used to describe Lorenzo de Medici in Florence, his collection. And museum actually means a seat of muses and is used for philosophical institution or a place of contemplation. So,
Huh.
yeah. But the world's first museum is in
Ancient Egypt.
no. I mean, it's usually the answer, but it's in the UK.
Uh,
I mean, I did set you up for failure there, and I'm sorry. Because it's always the answer I always want is ancient Egypt, but it's actually in Oxford and at the university, and it's Ashmolean. I don't know. That must be a dude. Oh yeah, that's the founder. And so
Some
he
dude.
some dude. So he gave his collection of unique goods to University of Oxford in 1677, and then it was open to the public in 1683, and it's just artifacts, specimens, curiosities that fascinated people during those times.
Mm.
And then in Germany, they actually had something similar going at the same time, but they called it Wondercarmen.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's pronunciation.
Yeah.
And which is just translated to an eccentric cabinet of curiosity. And it was either literally a cabinet or a room that housed strange and curious objects. And people would come in, like pay to come and visit them. We obviously hit the Enlightenment in Europe, and the social outlook began to change, and a demand to open museums to a wider audience emerged. So, according to, these Greek ideals, these classic ideals, that were now becoming really popular in the Enlightenment. They believed that the institution of the museum was a model of moral virtue, which was capable of building a new society. So everyone should have the opportunity to learn and have it as a public resource and convey a sense of national belonging. So that's when you start to see a lot of the major museums start to come around. And then like in the 19th century, you see all the capital cities in Europe have chain repurposed palaces or started to make completely new buildings to house all of their treasures. And they even, like, if you think of a traditional museum, even the architecture is an ode to the ideals of the Enlightenment and their like obsession with classical architecture. So you have like Roman pilasters, those traditional classic columns and classical pediments. And yeah, it's even the architecture was from the same time.
As you might expect, there are many very bizarre things stored in museums. And one of my favorite things is a curator challenge that they started. Basically, a UK museum challenged curators across the world to share their creepiest objects, and it got real weird. Yeah, so it was a Yorkshire museum that basically started this hashtag Curator Battle and creepiest object. Amazing. And so they started off the challenge with a 3rd or 4th century bun of hair from a
What?
Roman lady. It still has its bun pins in place, which is like is very weird. Like it kind of just looks like a bird's nest at this point. Then, like, there's a troubling taxidermy sidebar to this. So the Natural Museum, his Sciences Museum had this, like, what they're calling a taxidermied is supposed to be a taxidermied mermaid.
Yeah,
It is
okay. Moving on.
genuinely terrifying looking. And, definitely the plague masks are pretty creepy and weird.
And I feel like they would win because they're very topical, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Then there's this, like, creepy bear drinking, like, it's a very poorly taxidermied bear. The Tower of London has a executioner's mask that looks genuinely terrifying as well because it has, like, an iron smiling muzzle, and
Hmm.
it was designed for public humiliation. And then, obviously, all of the creepy dolls are
Oh.
just, like, the stuff of nightmares. They're so, as you were saying, there are so many things that museums have in their collection but are not displayed, and so I think that this challenge really brought out the weirdest and creepiest things that are hidden in, like, different museums around the world. But one of the other things, and I remember reading about trying to study the brain of Einstein, and so you can actually go to a
Mm.
museum and see part of Einstein's brain on display, which is, like, weird also in a different way. I find, like, there's such so you talked a lot about sculpture and art, and I keep bringing up weird human body parts, and I think that that's a really bizarre thing where there's a museum that has, like, Elvis's toenail, and there's, like, all of these, like, there's a museum in northern, I think it's either in northern England or Scotland, that has, I think it's Scotland, that has a book that's bound out of human skin leather from, like, this notorious criminal. It's disgusting. It was, just another sidebar.
I feel like those are not the type of museums that I traditionally think about. I think more about art galleries and these like big institutions. And then you
Mm.
get really, really weird museums
Yeah.
that house things, medical things, which I just want to avoid, to be honest.
This is, like, an undeniable segue into the museum that is literally horrifying. There is a picture that I will show you later, and it is the Avanos Hair Museum in Turkey. And it's in the Cappadonian area of Turkey, which is super stunningly beautiful, and it has, like, all of this pottery and ceramics and tons of history. But there is this hair museum that displays locks of hair from female visitors, And they say it's from a sweet story that a local potter was bidding farewell to a friend and asked for something to remember her by. So she cut off a lock of her hair and he put it up and told the story. And then other women started leaving pieces of their hair as well. And so now they think that it has 16,000 samples and it's in the Guinness Book of Records for like the most hair. And there's a place in the museum that has this curved like archway that you can walk through and it's just all of these like bits of hair hanging down. It's genuinely gross. And you also are apparently once or twice a year they will choose a winning lock of hair. They'll send you a message and they'll invite you to stay at their guest house. But I just feel like there's so many creepy things that I don't know if I want to stay there.
Yeah, I'm probably gonna pass on that, to be honest. Just really quickly, list the largest and most visited museums in the world, just so
Mhm.
our fans know. So we have the Louvre in Paris, the Met in New York City, the National Museum of China in Beijing, the Smithsonian institutions in Washington, D.C., the British Museum and National Gallery in London, and the Vatican Museums in Vatican City. But what do you think is always rated the best museum in the world?
The Louvre?
You have to
The
guess.
Louvre? Question mark.
No, the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. Because
Interesting.
people love Impressionist art. They love it.
Yeah. But that's because you can just like, "Oh, this art makes me feel rage mixed with sorrow."
I mean, no one's gonna judge you if that's how you interpret that, but I don't know if, like, the water lilies really give me that rage feeling, but art is in the eye of the beholder,
Exactly,
so
which is why I do love art museums, but I thought you might be able to tell me some of your top tips for not looking like a total dummy at a museum.
I feel like this is not a question for me. This is a question for Andrew because that man is so ridiculous in every museum we go into. And so I've taught him like some quick facts on how to identify art. So of course he walks around and he's like, "Oh, you got your mayonnaise and your Monets." But he recently wrote them down. Oh, is there fruit on a table? That's a Cezanne. Is there a weird neck? That's a Modigliani. He's like, it's a bunch of dots? It's a Seurat. You have some Titian women? It's a Gauguin. Some sunflowers in a field? That's a Van Gogh. Some melting clocks? That's a Dolly. I'm a wicked art snob. That's
This is
literally,
direct quote from Andrew Sparks.
yeah, he thinks he's like so good at this now. So,
Mm.
my top that those are some good top tips. Yeah, for art museums at the least.
And just like your chubby baby versus like cute
Yeah.
baby versus ugly baby distinctions between art eras.
Yeah, and another one would be just read the plaques. They will tell you so much information, and you could be like, "Oh, guess what? I saw this piece of art or like this artifact, and this is what it said." And then you know things. That's how learning works.
Such good top tips. But I find it really odd, and I don't know where this comes from. Why are museums so quiet? They're like mausoleum churches.
Well,
Why?
I think they're really large, so you have to think about that too. Like the sheer volume, and their ceilings are always really high. I mean, a lot of museums repurpose, like the Louvre is an old palace, so it's like it wasn't built for a museum. Although, a lot of museums are famous in their own right because of their architecture. Like you think of the
Mm.
Guggenheim by Frank Gehry, famous Canadian. Like the Pyramid at the Louvre by I.M. Pei, those kind of things. But I don't know. I feel like you kind of it is, if you think of the original word as a place of contemplation, like maybe people just kind of treat it like a library where they don't chat a lot. I mean, I don't really know.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's fine to like talk in a museum, but
Mhm. I think that it is a bit it's, almost a misperception that you have to be quiet in a museum.
yeah.
I think that there is an element of respect because sometimes you're walking around, like, invaluable cultural artifacts and just horsing around, as my mom would say, is not ideal
Right.
in those situations. But at the same time, I think that there's something to be said about, as I said, some of my favorite museums are the ones that have these interactive elements that you're
Yeah.
safely able to experience and use other senses, or that bring in other elements. I remember at the National Gallery in Ottawa, the Canadian Gallery, they had this installation that was each member of a choir was recorded separately, and they had speakers set up so that you could walk through sound and you could hear different voices at different spaces in the room and things like that that make it immersive and interactive. And I think that's super cool. Or when we went to the Gomley exhibit a
Oh,
year and a half.
Anthony Gormley in
Yeah.
sculptor? Yeah.
And you can actually, like, walk between and underneath some of the sculptures, and I think that was really, really cool because you could actually interact in some way with the art without actually causing it damage. So I think that's pretty cool when there's interactive elements.
Yeah, no, I think that's really cool. I mean, I think every museum takes a risk that those artifacts are gonna be could be possibly be ruined, but I do think that that's some of the best ways to learn is always to have like, the kids sections of museums are always the best sections. It's just it's what
One of the Yeah, one of the cool things that I saw when I was, in Italy, I was at I must have been in Florence because I was at the Birth of Venus painting by Botticelli, so that must be somewhere in Florence.
it's in Florence, you're correct. It's in the Uffizi.
Correct.
Yeah.
And they actually now have, beside the actual picture, they have a braille version. So they have a version of the painting that people that have visual impairments can actually feel, so they can feel the painting, and they have
Oh,
that
I
set to the side,
love
which
that.
I was just like, I love it when people creatively make art more accessible in different ways, whether it's in the kids section where there's ways to explore different types of painting, to like having like audio tours and tools for the visually impaired to enjoy art. I think that's so cool.
Yeah, that is really, really cool. Um
But you know that my fascination for museums is mostly for the strangest ones. So
Mhm.
you gave me the list of the most famous museums in the world. I'm going to list some of the weirdest museums in the world,
Go.
and you can tell me which ones you want to go to.
Okay.
Number one, a twine ball museum.
No.
This is in Minnesota. It's the largest twine ball is housed here, and it attracts people every year to host Twine Ball Day.
Yeah, no, I probably wouldn't go to that one.
There's one near us in Kent in the UK. It's a dog collar museum.
I mean, a
It
little
has
weird, but I like dogs.
Yeah, well, it's at Leeds Castle, so I think we should go
Oh,
there on
so
one of our bike trips,
yeah.
and it has 130 historical dog collars, including one that belonged to a mastiff in the 15th century.
Oh, cool. I wonder what it
Yeah,
looks like. I mean, we'd have to go and see.
we'll have to go and see. One that I will absolutely not go to is the Cockroach Museum.
No, I'm not going.
No, already pass.
Yeah.
But it's even weirder because it's not only just like what are the unusual types of cockroaches you could have, it actually does have live cockroaches, and it also has like cockroaches that have been dressed up like celebrities. So there's a Liberace in a house coat with a miniature piano, and like there's like all of these like Elvis and Britney Spears and Santa Claus roaches, which I'm just like, okay, there's a line at a certain point
Yeah.
where
Yeah.
I'm just not into it.
Yeah.
And one that I find really kind of sweet and I would definitely go see is in Croatia, and it's the Museum of Broken Relationships.
Oh, yeah, I would totally see that.
I quite love this. It's dedicated to failed love relationships, and you leave behind personal objects that have been left by former lovers with a brief description. And So the one of the examples is there's a bottle of wine and the plaque beside it says bottle of wine 1989 to 2010 London, England. We've been together in secret for years. The bottle of wine was drank when we both left our spouses. We never did. Oh, this bottle of wine was to be drank when we both left our spouses. We never did, and over the years our relationship came to a quiet end. I asked for the wine back. He reluctantly gave it, with bits of my heart he still held.
Oh. Oh, come on.
Yeah. So it's quite I think it's quite a cool one. There is a virtual, component to this museum, and you can upload, images and documents as well. One that I am going to put on our list, even though we will regret this decision so much. One of the trips I want us to do this summer is to cycle around the Isle of Wight, which is in the south coast of England, and they have the National Pooh Museum.
I would go to that. I make
Or
so many Pooh jokes.
a Poohseum. And
Boo.
they guarantee that you're not going to feel down in the dumps. And they talk about educating people about the magic and secrets that live in Pooh.
I mean, probably I bet you, like, a sewage museum would be so interesting.
So actually, there is another museum that I really want to go to, but it's been under renovation. But the Paris Sewer Museum is
Mhm.
supposed to be so cool because in Paris, there's a network of tunnels under the city. So, like, you've probably heard of the catacombs. We've both been to the catacombs, but there's like many different layers of tunnels, which all had different functions in Paris. And part of it is these underground sewer tunnels. And also another cool museum that we can now book tickets to, so I really want to, is the Postal Museum in
Oh,
London,
yeah, I
where you get to
really
ride the mail train. So they used to have this secret passage of tunnels for the mail to be delivered underground in London. And with your ticket to that museum, you get to ride on this mail train. And they are accepting bookings now. So I looked it up. So we should pick a time and
yeah,
go to the mail
we should go to
museum.
that.
One of the other ones that I want to go to in the UK is in Northumberland, and it's the Alnwick Poison Garden.
Oh, that sounds
And
cool.
it is amazing. It is this garden that's filled with stunning trees and flowers,
That they're
but
all
also
poisonous?
100 of the world's most lethal plants.
Oh my god, that's so cool.
Isn't it? So some tourists have actually fainted or fallen ill because they've, like, smelled something or touched it,
That
and
would be
so, like,
you.
well, obviously. But, yeah, there's a sign at the front of the garden, like, "These plants can kill with skull and crossbones," but I just think it's so cool because it's these beautiful, idyllic plants in this stunning old area, and, you just can die from stopping and smelling those flowers. And then
Whoa.
one other one, and this is a special shout out to Mrs. H. In the vein that there's a lid for every pot and there's a museum for every possible person, there's a museum of cement.
Concrete or cement?
Cement.
Oh, weird.
Well, that's what it's called. It's a Spanish word, so maybe I'm interpreting it incorrectly, but it's in San Sebastian in Spain.
Yeah, I bet you
So
they would really like that.
I don't know that it would get the same number of visitors as like the Louvre or
I mean,
Musée d'Orsay, but if you're into your cement,
yeah,
that's the place to go. So those are kind of the top tips of some museums that I will and will not visit.
I like it. So you touched on museums in the pandemic and the really cool Twitter wars, I'd call, of who had the best weirdest artifact. And I do think it is something to touch on because obviously museums have struggled a lot in the pandemic, and there's been like a lot of debate of do they start selling their offerings. So I did look up some museums who've sold some of their pieces to private collections in the pandemic to make money, and I was like, oh, I don't know. A lot of people are like,
It's understandable, but also
it's understandable, but I feel
disappointing.
like it goes against everything that a museum stands for that we talked about. Probably the most famous thing I saw that was stolen, or not stolen.
Stolen by giving lots of money to the museum.
Yeah, probably by Jeff Bezos. No, but was a Jackson Pollock. So
Oh.
they sold that for 12 million, which is not an insignificant sum.
No.
Um, but
But
it's
can you
also,
imagine like how much rent some of these museums must pay, or the
yeah, like
tax on the
property
property?
tax.
Oh
Yeah.
my goodness. So I understand needing 12 million just to get through a year.
And there's some museums who've continued to pay their staff throughout the entire pandemic, which is
Mm.
obviously lovely and a nice person thing to do. So, they've definitely operated at a loss. But there's also this conversation about how a lot of museums have now been like forced to like jump into the future quite quickly and offer virtual tours of the museum. For example, like the V&A in London had Lewis Carroll Alice in Wonderland summer show for like last year 2020, and they put it all online virtual, and they even created like a VR game based on Wonderland where people could follow their own white rabbit and solve the caterpillar's riddles and visit the Queen of Hearts garden and like so much more. And then people are like, well, art museums, like, aren't you expected to see the originals? And then so I looked into this, and you're like,
Mm.
all Victorian museums didn't display the like real antiquities. They displayed copies of everything they owned. So
Really?
yeah, and the value of these copies of these like plaster casts were worth so much money, and especially like in North America and the US and Canada, they museums didn't have like any real antiquities, and so they had to have plaster casts. And so like this British art critic Jonathan Jones was like, this is not a new age of like fakery or forgery. This is like just a new version of an era of knowledge. And I was like, that's actually a really good point.
I have a question for you. I'm
Uh-oh.
sure that this, you almost certainly don't know the answer, but you might. But are there any like really famous examples of like when things were passed off as real in museums, and or museums purchasing fakes for like, I'm sure this happens all the time. Like I feel like this is a thing.
Oh, Jennifer, art forgery is like my jam. I love it. So I don't really know about like antique stuff because I wonder if that's harder to sell, but then I was like, oh, there's so many good examples. So like watch Made You Look on Netflix. It's an art forgery documentary about a gallery in New York City that is now closed down from the scandal. And they had they tricked so many people and had so many fakes. But John Matt, Myatt, I don't know. He is known as committing the biggest art fraud of the 20th century, and like he faked Van Goghs, and he tricked both like Sotheby's and Christie's and sold his fakes through them, and like out of like hundreds of thousands of pounds, and like was convicted and went to jail. But like there's got to be so many fakes still in circulation.
But do you feel like there's any sort of like weird moral line here? Like, is there something sacred about seeing the actual object compared to like some of these really good forgeries that have tricked experts and curators? Like, is there something like, should we feel duped as a consumer when we go to see, say we went to see the Rosetta Stone and it was a fake Rosetta Stone? Do you feel like that takes away from the experience of museums? Like,
I don't think it takes away when you know it's a fake. Like if you're still learning from it, like if someone is really into art but they, can't afford to fly to Paris and go to the Louvre or the Musée d'Orsay, yeah, looking online and seeing those images or seeing a like reproduction in, you know, wherever they live, that's fine. But I think you cross a line when you're when it's a lie. Like
I
you
guess
can't.
that's the question though, because if so, in the optimally, which probably happens a lot, a museum would put on the sign like this is a reproduction of the actual artifact.
Yeah.
And that's completely fine. Everyone knows this. But what if you went to a museum and you thought you saw the real thing and it wasn't the real thing and it wasn't said that it wasn't the real thing?
Well, then you're lying, and I think a lot of books, like say the Bible, and other, I think all cultures would say that lying is not good. Yeah.
Hilariously, I was just looking this up because I wanted to see other examples of artifact forgery that is an art forgery, which is like obviously more popular. Um, but speaking of the Bible, there were these curators that were faked by these donated Dead Sea Scroll fragments.
Yeah,
And,
that's actually a super famous example,
well,
the Dead Sea Scrolls.
the guy who donated them, because you get a tax credit for the amount that you of an artifact, so they're like usually a fragment sells for $1 million or so, so you get like a tax write-off. But the guy that donated them was the president of Hobby Lobby. So I feel like he's just like sitting in his basement with all of the craft supplies in the world, just making up Dead Sea Scroll forgeries, which I find so funny. And it was the Museum of the Bible, which is in DC. And they said that over half of the artifacts in the museum are fakes. Oh, one of the other things that I was just going to say, because I was then looking up in the category of weird museums, there is a museum of art fakes, which
nice.
is so cool. It's Flauscher Museum in Vienna. And it has no original work, but it has fake Rembrandts and Matisses, and they're all forgeries. And so they're kind of like celebrating these forgeries, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, I'm into that. I mean, what I would say is obviously a lie is, I think, morally across all cultures, no one's going to argue lying is good. But then when it goes back into purchasing fake artifacts, I mean, then you're committing a legitimate crime. Like that is fraud. Yeah. You're frauding people of their money, or people or institutions, and that's when it's becomes a criminal act. And that's a big no-no.
Yeah, that did wander a little bit away from like the idea of virtual museums, but I kind of think that this idea of having to shift to an online world is great in some ways, because as you were saying, it makes it more accessible. Like people are able to enjoy and learn from all over the world, all different cultures, all different museums. And it kind of reminds me of the transition that I feel libraries were forced to make in the last 20 years, where people are spending less time in physical libraries, but recognizing that libraries still have a really important role in terms of making education accessible, making knowledge accessible, and as a community space. And I feel like museums have a different role, but they're a repository of such cultural and historic knowledge, and there's like highly skilled individuals in that area, but it's like, how can we make it relevant to the like modern lifestyle where most people don't go to museums very frequently, but
yeah,
they're still goods.
Still
not
goods.
All of us are super museum nerds.
That's weird, because learning is fun, guys.
Learning is so fun.
Learning is fun.
Also, not everyone is the keener on the guided tours. That just like has to be right at the front, asking all the questions.
Yeah. God, I love a good walking tour.
Oh,
They're just the best.
Yeah. We need to do an entire episode on walking tours, because really terrific.
Really terrific. So, some famous things from May 18th. I'm just going to do things, because there's actually some big stuff. So, The First Crusade happened in 1096. Not great, you know? Not everyone.
But maybe there's artifacts in museums from that.
Possible. Possible. The 7 Years' War began when Great
Also not great.
Britain declared war on France. But I do appreciate the name because then you just know a lot about it just from the name, you know?
What year did it start in?
1756.
Okay.
So you know what year it ended. Napoleon Bonaparte is proclaimed to be the Emperor of France. And lastly, in 1980, the students of Gwangju in South Korea, kind of close where Karen and I lived, had very famous demonstrations in which the dictator killed a lot of Korean students and forced South Korea to become a democracy. So, pretty good. Pretty good.
Yeah. In terms of other things to celebrate, May 18th doesn't have a lot because we're really busy. There's a lot of museums to celebrate, so we don't have a lot of other things. It is World AIDS Vaccine Day, which is actually really exciting because all of the work in the COVID vaccine over the past year might have furthered the search for the AIDS vaccine in a way that we haven't seen, and it accelerated that research. So it's a really great day to remember the decades of work that's been going into the search for an AIDS vaccine. So that's fantastic.
Yeah, that's really good. Okay, bye, Jen.
Bye.
See you later.
These are the days, my friends, the hours and descends. Let's sing and dance and make a bunch of noise, so let the fun ensue and learn a thing or two. These are the days.